Welcome to Say More from Boston Globe Opinion. I'm Jim Dao, the opinion editor. On this month's political panel, we want to dive into a topic that's been one of the most complex and heated issues of the day. That is, the conflict in Israel and Palestine. In particular, the U.S. relationship with Israel and how it's changing. With me in the studio are two Globe opinion writers who are experts and also have a personal relationship with this issue. Abdallah Fayyad and Shira Schoenberg, thanks both of you for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.
I first want to drive home to our listeners that this topic is not just an intellectual exercise for both of you. Can you quickly talk about your relationship with the region?
Sure. So I was born in the United States, but when I was 2 years old, my parents, who are Palestinian, moved back, and I was raised in Jerusalem all the way through high school. So I still have a lot of family there in Jerusalem and other parts of in East Jerusalem and other parts of the West Bank. And yeah, that's my relationship there.
I'm a Jewish American, and I have spent a lot of time in Israel, and I also have close family and close friends who live there.
I want to start our discussion with the way Israel has been showing up in Democratic primary elections across the country. In a number of races, Israel has become a wedge issue, particularly on the left. In Maine, for instance, the Democratic insurgent in the race for U.S. Senate, Graham Plattner, has been very critical of Israel and talked about ending U.S. aid to Israel. And he's well ahead of Governor Janet Mills in the polls. In San Francisco, several candidates running to replace Nancy Pelosi, who's a staunch supporter of Israel, have called Israel's invasion of Gaza genocide. And then perhaps most prominently, we have New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani, who last year very publicly criticized Israel, particularly for the war in Gaza. And for many years, he's supported the Palestinian cause. He won handily, even though New York City politicians have historically been really supportive of Israel. Shira, I want to start with you. What do you think has shifted in the Democratic Party?
Well, I think to some extent, it's not even solely about Israel, but Israel has become a very easy litmus test. It's a code way of saying, are you a progressive or are you a centrist? And it's very easy for someone like Graham Plattner to yell, condemn the genocide in Gaza. It can be harder to take a nuanced view and discuss, well, maybe Israel did go too far in the war in Gaza, but maybe it's not a genocide. And let's talk about what role the U.S. should have in rebuilding Gaza. So I think it's really just become a way for progressives to define themselves a cause celeb. And we have seen in the polls a shift that Democrats and young people are less likely to support Israel. So we're seeing that in the Democratic candidates.
Abdallah, I actually wanted to raise that poll with you. The decline in support for Israel among Democrats has been noticeable, but it's really particularly noticeable among young Democrats. And overall, I think that decline in support has, for the first time, led to the American public having an overall unfavorable view of Israel. What do you think is driving this apparent alienation from involving younger Democrats towards Israel?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And it's also, I would note, not just young Democrats in particular, though that is where we've seen the most change. But when you look at independents broadly, and especially young independents, there has been a change. Much less so among Republican voters, but when you look at young Republicans, there has also been a change as well. And I think part of what we're seeing here is the fact that what Israel has done in Gaza since 2023 has been live streamed to the world. So there was a disconnect between what a lot of young people were seeing on social media and what a lot of their politicians were saying. And I think that disconnect really made a lot of people angry because what they had been seeing is essentially, what has now been deemed by leading human rights organizations around the world, including Israeli human rights organizations, a genocide. And they had not seen the Democratic Party respond with the kind of moral red lines that you would expect from your elected officials, particularly because when it comes to issues of war, and especially when it comes to genocide, it's something that can be clearly a red line for many politicians. And I think young people seeing politicians take this, tepid step to criticize Israel here, but then give unlimited, unconditional aid to Israel in the midst of all of this, I think created a lot of anger about this issue and has only galvanized more support for the Palestinians than we had ever seen, I think, in American history.
I also think, and I will be clear that there are obviously also international scholars that dispute the use of the word genocide to describe Israel's war in Gaza. But I think what we're seeing is this generational shift that you have a lot of older people, I'm thinking the Joe Biden generation of Democrats, that remember that Israel was founded as a haven for a persecuted minority. Israel has fought for its existence. They remember the years of Oslo when there was hope that Israel and its Palestinian neighbors could work out their disagreements for themselves. And they see Israel as a liberal democratic ally to the West among a sea of autocratic Arab nations in the Middle East. What you've seen since then is the younger generation has really seen almost 20 years of an Israel governed by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, a very right-wing government. There's been, Israel is now seen more as an aggressor. And you're right, they have seen these images live streamed out of Gaza, which are incredibly disturbing. So I just think that that's a shift in what Israel's been the last 20 years and how Israel is perceived by certain segments of the public, particularly young people and Democrats.
I'd like to come back to Netanyahu in a couple minutes, but I wanted to shift this just slightly to Washington and talk a bit about Congress. Last week, the Senate rejected a resolution that would have blocked sales of bulldozers and bombs to Israel. But even though it blocked it, that resolution got more votes than bills of its type have previously received. Do either of you think that this era of very strong, often kind of automatic support of Israel is now over?
I mean, I think it's not over, but it's definitely moving in that direction, because when you look at the Democratic establishment, there's still a lot of unconditional support for Israel. We most recently saw that in the New York City mayoral race. So there's this perception that the Democratic Party has really shifted, but what we're seeing is that the left within the Democratic Party has really shifted and made this a central issue, while the establishment has still moved more or less in line with what the party has stood for in the bipartisan consensus on U.S. relations with Israel. So we saw this most recently in the New York City mayoral race, where establishment Democrats took a really long time to, and in some cases did not endorse Zoran Mamdani, despite him being the Democratic nominee for mayor. In large part because of his views on Israel. So I wouldn't say that this era of unconditional support for Israel is completely out the window. Still, a lot of powerful people within the Democratic Party have the politics of old, I think, on this issue. But we are seeing a real shift, and voters are starting to hold these elected officials more and more accountable on that kind of unconditional support for Israel. And I think, as you noted, that change that we've seen in support for these bills over the last decade, the fact that it's growing, I think Israel is slowly but surely becoming a more partisan issue, where Republicans will be the more reliable supporters of Israel, at least, and this is clearly Netanyahu's view himself, and Democrats are much more split on the issue within the party and more feel like they're drifting further and further away from Israel.
Shira, I'd like to get your take. Do you think that's true, that it's becoming more partisan? And if you do agree that it's true, what does that bode for Israel and its supporters in Congress if it's very much a partisan issue, do you think?
I actually agree with Abdallah on this, that I think there is a real split in the Democratic Party. And it's not clear which direction it's going in. I mean, if you look at the 2024 elections, Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush were both members of Congress that were very critical of Israel, and both lost their seats to candidates that did make Israel an issue and support for Israel an issue on the campaign trail. I think you certainly see, for example, AIPAC is involved in supporting, pro-Israel, both Democrats and Republicans. And I think to some extent it will depend on what happens in the region. If war and conflict is no longer on the top of the news, if the ceasefires hold, then I think it's highly likely that we will go back to an environment of more bipartisan support for Israel. But a lot of it just depends on who ends up getting elected to Congress, and we'll have to wait and see.
Let's talk a little bit more about AIPAC. We are seeing in some cases, at least, where Democrats are divided and there's a primary involving maybe a centrist versus a progressive, that often candidates are disavowing AIPAC and refusing to take its money. And we see this most locally in the U.S. Senate primary, where Seth Moulton, the congressman who's challenging Ed Markey, has said he won't take AIPAC money. Seth Moulton is kind of a centrist, but Ed Markey is very much a pro-Palestinian sort of senator. And so it felt a little bit like Moulton was trying to address that issue by refusing to take AIPAC money. Do you guys think, is AIPAC becoming a little bit of a negative symbol for the Democratic Party, or at least for some Democrats?
To be honest, I see it as a fair amount of political pandering to a progressive base. I mean, it's kind of like you've always had politicians that will say, well, I'm not going to take money from the fossil fuel industry. And the question is, well, was the fossil fuel industry really lining up to support you? I think it's making a political statement that they think their voters want to see. You've always had, billionaire-backed PACs. You've always had dark money in politics. It's just a feature of our system. And there's no real reason to be singling out AIPAC as, the one pro-Israel lobby. It's just about political theater.
Well, just to push back on that a little bit, I think AIPAC does have an outsized role in lobbying power within Washington and around the country, and has had that influence for decades. I don't think that it is just like any other lobbying group. It has an enormous amount of money. The races that you mentioned, Shira, earlier with Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush, those were the most expensive House races in U.S. history because of the money that AIPAC poured in. And I think part of the reason AIPAC has become so toxic that, in fact, AIPAC doesn't brand its PAC as AIPAC within Democratic primaries, but under another vague name about supporting democracy. AIPAC's influence is really hard to ignore because it's not just a matter of candidates they support. It's also a matter of how they go after candidates who criticize Israel, as in the case of Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush. The attack ads you can expect from a candidate who supports Palestinian rights and liberation, are massive. And so that's, I think, what drives a lot of the fear, in Washington, and a lot of the fear of criticizing Israel. It's not because of where the voters are, but because Barack Obama said this in his autobiography. The first part that he released is that if you criticize Israel and if you criticize the government of Israel, then you should expect to face a well-funded opponent in your next election. So I think that's the real problem that makes AIPAC so central to a lot of the criticism about money in Washington these days.
I want to shift our conversation now to the war in Iran and Lebanon. There's been an intense political debate over whether Israel really pressured and forced Trump's hand into attacking Iran and getting into this war to begin with. Trump has said that it was a collaborative decision to combat a shared threat. Can you each tell me your view of this question? Abdallah, you want to go first?
Sure. I think it's undeniable that Benjamin Netanyahu has been lobbying for the U.S. to go to war with Iran for a very long time. It's not limited to Trump's presidency. He has tried to lobby other presidents as well. He came to visit Trump in Washington 6 or 7 times before this. This was clearly something that he was pushing for, and I think, that's undeniable. Whether Trump went to war solely on the basis of Netanyahu's advice, you never really know what's happening behind closed doors. All I know is that the president of the United States, can more or less tell Israel what to do, and Israel will fall in line. When Netanyahu approached Biden to try to drag the U.S. into war with Iran, Biden said, if you do this, you're going to have to go it alone. Trump could have taken the same position. So obviously, Trump, president of the United States, made this decision himself. But it is also undeniable that this is something that Netanyahu has really been pushing for. and also articulated, by administration officials. When Secretary of State Marco Rubio was talking about their rationale for, why Iran imposed an imminent threat, specifically said that the threat came from the fact that if Israel attacked Iran, then Iran would retaliate and put U.S. military assets at risk. So, in that rationale, instead of telling Israel, well, don't attack Iran, they essentially chose to go to war with them. So I do think obviously Trump is free to make his own decisions, but certainly that's what Israel had been lobbying the administration to do.
What I find funny is I've seen columns in the American media suggesting that Trump is doing whatever Netanyahu wants him to do, and then I read columns in the Israeli media suggesting that Netanyahu is doing whatever Trump wants him to do. I think the reality is that's the form of an alliance. They're both using each other to get what they want. I think in the case of Israel, Israel has always seen Iran as literally an existential threat. Iran's made no secret of the fact that it wants to destroy Israel, and it's been trying to build up the weapon capabilities to do that. I think on Trump's side, Trump, I think, clearly was convinced of the danger of a nuclear Iran. Israel clearly convinced him of the danger of Iranian ballistic missile productions. And I think to Trump, first of all, Iran tried to kill him in 2020, so there's something personal there. And there's also an appeal of being the one American president to finally do what no other prior president has done, which is, as he sees it, bring some stability to the Middle East, damaging Iranian capabilities, and potentially bringing regime change and dismantling the Iranian theocracy. I mean, did Trump go about it the right way? Did he disregard intelligence? Sure, he probably made a lot of mistakes in pursuing this war. But I think that's the intention, and I think he had plenty of his own reasons for going to war in Iran, rather than just the reasons that Israel stated.
Shira, I want to stay with you for a minute and get you to talk a bit about Netanyahu himself. He looms really large in all these conversations about American-Israeli politics and also the war in Iran. He's viewed, as Abdallah pointed out, as the key person and perhaps pressuring Trump to want to join this attack. But he's also the politician whose right-wing government has angered so many liberals and perhaps added to some of the dismay with Israel that's in the Democratic left. So I'd like to get your perception, and yours as well, Abdallah, about how much do you think he's driving perceptions, both negative and positive, of Israel in the United States right now?
I think a fair amount, just because, since the mid-1990s, Netanyahu's been prime minister for, I think, 19 years. Yeah. Israel keeps electing him, even though there's been incredible dissatisfaction with him among the Israeli public. You saw before the October 7th attacks, tens of thousands of Israelis were out in the streets protesting against his judicial reform. There's been protests in Israel against how Netanyahu has pursued some of the wars, against some of his policies. But the fact remains that Israelis elected him over and over again, and he's really shaped the country for the last 2 decades. And there's obviously already a very strong opposition campaign within Israel to defeat him in the next elections.
Well, actually, let me jump off the election point and ask you a question, Abdallah. The elections are scheduled. He's facing fairly serious opposition, it seems, from an increasingly united front. Do you think it's possible that if he is voted out of office, that some of this anger and frustration and dismay with Israel, particularly on the American left, might dissipate, or will it last beyond that?
I think, this goes to Shira's earlier point, whether we're in this temporary phase of criticism of Israel or if it's permanent. I think this is the aspect where it is temporary, because Netanyahu is an easy boogeyman for the left. He's a hardline right-winger, now has committed all of these atrocities, has an arrest warrant out. Israel has now been accused of genocide in the world's highest court because of him. So he's, an easy boogeyman, as this, right-wing wannabe autocrat kind of character that has unified the left for a long time. So I think part of what allows a lot of more centrist or moderate Democrats to criticize Israel is to criticize Israel only through the lens of Netanyahu. So when you take Netanyahu out of the picture, criticizing Israel becomes much more difficult for those centrist and more moderate Dems that are just trying to toe the line, because they don't know how to criticize Israel without criticizing Netanyahu. For them, he's an easy boogeyman. So I do think once you take him out of the equation, it does probably fracture the Democratic Party even more as to whether or not the U.S. relationship with Israel should stay the same or fundamentally change.
I'd like to talk a second about Trump's image in Israel. I was there last fall, and I went to rallies where Trump was really held up as a folk hero of sorts because he was pushing for peace. He did help broker a ceasefire, and my impression was that his standing there was stronger than it is in the United States. Do you think that's still the case, and has that been changed at all? Maybe strengthened in Israel with his decision to go to war with Iran?
So it was funny. I was actually driving around northern Israel a couple of years ago, and we just happened on this entrance to a village, and there was a big sign that said Trump Heights. I think they had named this area after President Trump. So there's certainly been a lot of support for President Trump in Israel. Look, I think he brought home the last of the Israeli hostages from Gaza. Those were innocent lives saved, and he deserves credit for that. He helped broker a ceasefire, which saved the lives of innocent Palestinians in Gaza. He deserves credit for that. And I think Israelis, by and large, were supportive of the decision to go to war in Iran, just because many of them do see Iran as such an existential threat. But that said, you also certainly have voices on the left in Israel that are very critical of President Trump, the same way they're critical of the Netanyahu government. So there's certainly a diversity of voices.
Abdallah, maybe broaden out from Israel. How do you think Trump is viewed in the Gulf states and other Arab states, or in Lebanon even, where there's also a war going on? Do you think he is viewed as a folk hero in any of those places? Or has the war in Iran changed views there?
I mean, that's a good question. I think there was a separation between the governments of those states and the people of those states. As for whether or not he's a folk hero, certainly I don't, I can't really speak on behalf of, those countries and how they feel about him. But I imagine that it's a much more fractured view. I think what I can talk about, for example, here among Arab Americans in the United States, there was, such disdain for the Biden administration for essentially giving Israel a blank check to do as it pleases in Gaza. And in the face of such death and destruction, there was very little, push to get Israel to stop by the Biden administration. And so you saw a lot of Arab Americans who had previously voted for Biden not show up to the election. A lot voted for Trump. A lot, I think, had faith that Trump would bring about a ceasefire. And I think when he did originally, I think that created a lot of goodwill among some in the Arab American community. But I think as time has gone on, the ceasefire has been violated many times as Trump's foreign policy in the Middle East becomes more and more bombastic and more, of the Bush era, destabilizing the Middle East. I think that kind of politics is only going to turn Arabs more against, Trump, the Republican Party. And I think Arabs in the Middle East, I think it'll turn them more and more against U.S. power, just as we saw the war in Iraq do. So I think that's the kind of dynamic that is unfolding there.
I think you've both sort of hinted at the possibility that whatever happens with the Israeli elections and also the U.S. midterms, that the U.S. relationship with Israel could well fundamentally change in the coming years. And I'd just be interested in getting both of your takes on what you think that relationship might look like. Certainly decades ago, there was a time when, as Abdallah pointed out, American presidents didn't hesitate to refuse requests or demands from Israel and basically took very, sometimes almost hostile positions against it. That seems to have been less the case in recent decades. Where do we think it's going now? And what if you could look ahead a few years, what do you think it's going to look like, the U.S. and Israeli relationship?
I mean, I think one really big question right now is just what happens next in Gaza. I mean, President Trump brokered the ceasefire, but what's going to happen with that land? Will the U.S. be also be able to hold the peace, rebuild Gaza, help the parties find the funding to rebuild in a way that provides dignity and self-determination for the Palestinian people and also safety and security for the Israeli people? And that's going to be a whole lot harder than brokering a temporary ceasefire. So I think it'll be just really important to keep an eye on what happens there. Obviously, the debate over arms sales to Israel, a lot of the foreign aid being given to Israel now is still a result of the 10-year MOU that President Obama signed in 2016. So if that expires and there are going to be more debates over the extent to which the U.S. should be providing foreign aid to Israel, I certainly think that's going to get a lot of discussion in Congress. But I do think that there is still that fundamental dynamic that Israel remains a staunch ally to the U.S. in a region with a lot of autocratic governments. So I think to some extent that fundamental alliance isn't going to change.
Abdallah, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's difficult to imagine the U.S. and Israel parting ways for good. Israel is a strategic ally of the United States, although I don't think it's, for reasons that shared democratic ideals. From my view, Israel is not a democracy. It governs over millions of people without their consent. But I do think it's a strategic military partnership. But it does also garner a very particular closeness and attention, that other allies of the United States, but for maybe the UK get. And I think that might change. So I think you'll probably still continue to see U.S. support for Israel in the long term. It's still going to be an ally of the United States, but maybe it won't be viewed as, this extremely special ally of the United States, as the closest ally of the United States, as all American presidents, I think, have called it at some point or another. I think that is probably going to change when Democrats get into power, maybe not in the next couple election cycles, but at some point. And I think this goes back to what we were talking about earlier. I think Netanyahu made the bet at some point that he's lost the Democrats and he's going to go all in on the Republicans. And this started out when he came to Congress on John Boehner's invitation when he was Speaker of the House, against Obama's wishes while Obama was still president. A lot of Democrats boycotted that speech in Congress and didn't show up. And since then, we've seen that kind of acrimony between Democrats and the Netanyahu government. So I think we'll probably see there's a lot of calls to reduce or eliminate funding for Israel, particularly military aid to Israel. I think we could see some form of that in the future. But as for whether or not Israel is going to be an ally of the United States, I don't think that's going to change anytime soon.
We've talked about the clear rise in anti-Semitic incidents, not just in the United States, but around the world in the last couple of years. But I think it's probably fair to say that there's been a clear rise in Islamophobic attacks on Muslim people or people perceived as being Muslim. And so I'd kind of like to close with getting at the question of whether this emerging, perhaps more visible bigotry, both on the left and on the right, is something that you think about and how you think about it. And I'm curious as to whether sort of in this period of intense passions and polarization, whether you think there's actually perhaps an opportunity here for both Muslims and Jews, in the United States in particular, to find a common cause here, given that they're both facing sort of these stronger feelings of bigotry coming from whatever sources, very often extreme sources. Is that possible, or is that a pipe dream in the same way that the two-state solution is kind of a pipe dream in Israel right now? What do you guys think? Do you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, I think it's certainly less of a pipe dream because it's not as intractable an issue as historical ties to a land. And I think, there's plenty of evidence in the present day and throughout history of Muslims and Jews, coexisting peacefully and with each other. But we're also seeing, I think, a lot of alliances form, on the left, for example, between Jewish politicians, Muslim politicians, and for example, I mentioned this earlier, but the New York City mayoral race was an example of this, where, Brad Lander, who was the comptroller and is Jewish American, really went all out to endorse Zoran Mamdani. And Brad Lander, I think, identifies as a liberal Zionist. I don't think he would identify as an anti-Zionist, for example. They don't agree on the issue all in all. I think they have different views on, what justice and accountability looks like, what the future for Palestinian looks like. They probably have a lot of disagreements there, but they formed an alliance. They have a similar worldview, similar morals, and I think that's a model, I think, for how a lot of these conversations can happen where it's productive. And I think there are a lot of, for example, Jewish voices, that are growing on the left, in support of Palestinian liberation. But I do think ultimately, the reason these conversations among all these different groups are so important is because undeniably these two groups, particularly when we're talking about Palestinians and Israelis, or globally Palestinians and Jews, is that our histories are inextricably linked, and so are our futures. And so, I think there is certainly, I think, hope for a better future in, how those two communities throughout the world interact. I think it's a more hopeful future probably than the future of Palestine, but I think they're just inextricably linked, and I think that's hard to ignore.
I think one of the biggest problems that we've seen in America overall and in discussions of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is there's an attempt to demonize the other and to think of the other as less than human or as the enemy. And what gives me hope is seeing the dialogue across the aisle, the way that Abdallah and I can sit here and have a civil, respectful conversation. I would love to see more of that happening on college campuses, in synagogues, in mosques and churches, and throughout the country, because I think if we can learn to talk to each other and see each other as human beings, I think that'll go a long way towards repairing some of the really ruptured relationships we've seen in America today.
Well, on that note, I'd really like to thank you both. This is such a difficult conversation, and I'm just so happy and appreciative that you both were willing to talk candidly today. Abdallah Fayyad is a writer for Globe Opinion Ideas, and Shira Schoenberg is an editorial writer for Globe Opinion. Thanks both for being here.